6:45 in the evening. The USS Abraham Lincoln was cutting a steady wake through the northern Arabian Sea. The carrier strike group had been operating under modified emission control for 48 hours. Yet the radar screens in the Combat Direction Center remained hauntingly clear. Something was approaching that the most advanced electronic eyes in the world were not designed to see. The air was heavy with the humid heat of the region, and the sea was a flat, glassy expanse reflecting the deep orange of a setting sun. Below the flight deck, 5,000 sailors were finishing their evening meals or preparing for the night watch. Unaware that a weapon traveling at 8,000 kilometers per hour was already within the strike group's inner defensive perimeter. The carrier was protected by the Aegis combat system, a multi-billion-dollar network of sensors and interceptors designed to create an impenetrable shield. At the heart of this shield was the AN/SPY-6 radar, a system capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously from the surface of the ocean to the edge of space. But as the clock ticked towards 6:46, the system remained silent. The Iranian Fattah-2 hypersonic glide vehicle was not following a predictable ballistic arc. It was skipping along the upper atmosphere, encased in a shroud of superheated plasma that absorbed the radar pulses of the American defenders. By the time the atmospheric friction began to bleed off the weapon's speed, it was already too late for the automated responses of the carrier strike group. The first indication of the disaster was not an electronic chirp or a glowing red icon on a console. It was a physical sensation. On the flight deck, a handful of sailors moving a parked FA-18 Super Hornet looked toward the eastern horizon and saw a streak of white light that seemed to tear the sky in half. There was no sound of an approaching engine, only a sudden, violent displacement of air. The missile, moving at Mach 7, did not rely on a massive explosive warhead to do its work. Its primary weapon was its own kinetic energy, a mass of nearly 2,000 kilograms moving at several times the speed of a high-powered rifle bullet. The impact was catastrophic. The hypersonic vehicle slammed into the starboard side of the USS Abraham Lincoln, just below the flight deck level near elevator number 3. The steel hull, 22 inches of reinforced armor designed to withstand torpedoes and cruise missiles, offered almost no resistance to the concentrated force of the strike. The missile punched through the outer skin and continued deep into the interior of the ship, shredding 3 decks of administrative offices, ready rooms, and berthing areas in less than 1/100th of a second. The secondary explosion erupted an instant later as the missile's remaining fuel and a small high-explosive charge ignited inside the confined spaces of the hangar deck. A fireball of white and yellow flame surged outward, blowing the massive steel doors of Elevator 3 off their tracks and sending them spinning into the sea like discarded toys. The shock wave rolled through the length of the 1,000-foot vessel, lifting sailors off their feet and throwing heavy equipment across the deck. In the Combat Direction Center, the lights flickered and died for 3 terrifying seconds before the emergency red lighting bathed the room in a bloody glow. The air was suddenly filled with the acrid, metallic stink of burnt electronics and the thick, choking smell of atomized jet fuel. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the deck beneath his feet shudder with a frequency he had never experienced in 25 years of naval service. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the centerpiece of American power projection in the region, was no longer an aggressor. It was a victim. The Aegis system, the pride of the United States Navy, had been bypassed by the sheer physics of hypersonic flight. As the fire alarms began to scream throughout the ship, the crew of the Lincoln realized they were facing a threat that their manuals said should not have been possible. 7 in the evening. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a landscape of orange flame and thick, oily black smoke that blotted out the remaining twilight. The carrier was located at coordinates 15 degrees 30 minutes north, 62 degrees 15 minutes east. Even as the hull still vibrated from the primary impact, the internal discipline of the United States Navy began to take hold. This was the moment for which every sailor on board had trained thousands of hours. The call for general quarters had been replaced by the chilling manual announcement of mass casualty, starboard side, frames 100 through 160. The primary threat was the fire. Thousands of liters of JP-5 jet fuel had been released when the missile severed the primary fuel lines, running beneath the flight deck. The liquid fire was now cascading down into the hangar bay, creating a furnace where the temperature was rapidly climbing, toward 1,500 degrees. On the flight deck, the yellow-shirted aircraft handlers and the red-shirted crash and salvage crews moved with the precision of a practice machine. They were not running away from the devastation. They were driving their P-25 firefighting vehicles directly into the heat. Firefighting vehicles directly into the heat. The air boss, stationed in the primary flight control tower, looked down through reinforced glass that was already beginning to crack from the thermal stress. Below him, two FA-18 Super Hornets, parked near the impact zone, were already engulfed. The magnesium wheels of the aircraft were burning with a blinding white intensity that could melt through the steel deck plating in minutes. He keyed his radio, his voice calm despite the carnage. He ordered the immediate activation of the flight deck washdown system. Seconds later, hundreds of nozzles embedded in the deck began to spray a mixture of seawater and aqueous film forming foam, known as AFFF, across the burning surface. Beneath the flight deck, in the cavernous hangar bay, the situation was even more dire. The impact had shattered the overhead sprinkler mains, rendering the automatic suppression systems in the midsection of the ship useless. The hangar was filled with the roar of burning fuel and the rhythmic thud of secondary explosions as small arms ammunition and survival gear inside the parked aircraft began to cook off. Repair Locker 5, the primary damage control unit for the starboard side, was the first on the scene. 30 sailors, encased in heavy silver fire-retardant suits and breathing through self-contained oxygen masks, advanced into the smoke. The lead nozzleman felt the heat through his gloves, a searing pressure that felt like standing in front of an open-blast furnace. They were fighting to save the ship, but they were also fighting to save their shipmates. Through the haze, they could see the twisted remains of Elevator 3. The massive steel platform had been buckled upward, creating a jagged ramp that allowed the wind from the carrier's forward motion to whip the flames into a frenzy. The wind, carrying the sharp scent of salt spray and the heavy, chemical bite of the firefighting foam, was both a blessing and a curse. It cleared some of the smoke, but fed the oxygen-hungry inferno. On the bridge, the captain monitored the damage reports flowing in from the damage control assistant. The report was grim. The ship had lost primary power to the starboard steering gear, and 3 of the 4 main fire pumps in the forward machinery room were offline due to electrical shorts. The Lincoln was currently steaming at 12 knots, a speed barely sufficient to maintain steerage. To the east, the rest of Carrier Strike Group 3 was closing the distance. The destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser USS Princeton were already sprinting toward the carrier, their own damage control teams standing by and their radars searching the empty sky for a second strike. The sky above the Arabian Sea was no longer dark. It was stained a deep bruised crimson by the reflection of the fires on the low-hanging clouds. The sound of the ocean, usually a steady white noise against the hull, was drowned out by the scream of sirens and the rhythmic, metallic clanging of heavy tools against steel as teams worked to shore up buckled bulkheads. Every man and woman on the Lincoln knew that the first hour would decide the fate of the vessel. If the fire reached the magazine where the Mark 84 bombs were stored, the USS Abraham Lincoln would become a funeral pyre. Their professionalism was the only barrier between survival and a catastrophic loss that would change the course of the war. 7:15 in the evening. The Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a tomb of blue light and frantic, whispered calculations. While the flight deck above was a theater of fire and screams, this windowless compartment was the brain of the ship, now reeling from a digital concussion. The air here was kept at a constant 68 degrees to protect the processors, but the smell of ozone and scorched circuit boards from a secondary electrical surge was thick enough to taste. The operations officer stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the massive glass displays that should have provided a clear picture of the battle space, but instead showed only the frustratingly empty wake of a ghost. The technical team was already scrubbing the recorded sensor data from the AN/SPY-6 radar. The Aegis combat system had been set to its highest level of automated defense, yet the system logs showed that the radar had never achieved a firm track. At the moment of impact, the processing cores had been looking for a ballistic trajectory, a predictable arc that a computer could calculate in microseconds. The Iranian Fattah-2 had not provided one. Instead, the weapon had performed a series of lateral maneuvers at an altitude of 30,000 meters, staying just inside the clutter zone where the radar struggled to distinguish between a physical object and atmospheric disturbances caused by the missile's own plasma sheath. A junior radar technician, his face pale in the glow of his workstation, pointed to a series of flickering data points. At 7:12, 3 minutes before the hit, the system had registered a momentary high-velocity atmospheric anomaly. To the software, it had looked like a sensor error or a flock of birds moving at Mach 6, a logical impossibility that the Aegis algorithms had filtered out as background noise. The hypersonic glide vehicle had been traveling at over 2,000 meters per second, creating a vacuum of superheated air behind it that effectively absorbed the radar pulses of the carrier. It was a failure, not of the hardware, but of the very logic used to define a threat. The tactical action officer called for a data link update from the rest of Carrier Strike Group 3. The cruiser USS Princeton and the destroyer DDG-51 were now feeding their own radar pictures into the Lincoln's network, trying to triangulate the point of origin. The coordinates were calculated at 25 degrees north, 58 degrees east, a mobile launcher hidden in the rugged coastal mountains of southern Iran. The strike had been perfectly timed to coincide with the carrier's turn into the wind, a moment when the ship's own electronic profile was at its most vulnerable. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the sound of the ship's primary alarm, a rhythmic, piercing electronic pulse, was the only thing breaking the silence of the technicians. They were now manually adjusting the sensitivity of the SPY-6 arrays, bypassing the automated filters that had betrayed them. They were looking for the plasma wake, the trail of ionized air that a hypersonic weapon leaves behind. It was like trying to track a bullet by looking for the heat of the air it passed through, rather than the bullet itself. The stakes were absolute. The intelligence reports suggested the Iranians had at least 4 more of the missiles ready for launch. The executive officer arrived in the center, his uniform stained with the gray soot of the hangar fire. He checked the status of the Mark 41 vertical launch systems on the Escort ships. The strike group was now shifting to a manual override posture, where humans would take the final shot instead of relying on the computer's logic. The air in the room felt heavy, the silence between the electronic chirps filled with the knowledge that the technological gap they had relied on for 40 years had just been closed. The ghost in the machine wasn't a software bug, it was a new reality of warfare, where speed had finally outrun the speed of thought. 7:40 in the evening. Deep within the 4th and 5th decks of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the battle was no longer against a missile, but against the weight of the ocean itself. The impact of the foreign military hypersonic vehicle had created a jagged, 10-meter puncture, just 2 meters above the waterline. But as the carrier listed 4 degrees to starboard, the Arabian Sea began to pour into the hull. With the force of a high-pressure fire hose, the interior compartments were a nightmare of twisted aluminum and severed electrical cables that whipped and sparked like dying snakes in the rising water. The air was a heavy, suffocating mixture of atomized hydraulic fluid, salt spray, and the acrid smoke of burning insulation. Damage control teams from Repair Locker 3 were already waist-deep in the freezing, oily water. They carried hydraulic jacks, heavy timber shores, and steel wedges, moving with a grim, practiced efficiency that had been forged in 1,000 drills. Petty Officer Second Class Miller led the team, his flashlight beams struggling to penetrate the thick, swirling mist of steam and smoke. He could hear the groan of the ship's internal skeleton, the sound of 6-inch steel beams bending under the weight of thousands of tons of pressure. Every few seconds, a loud, metallic crack echoed through the space, the sound of weld seams failing under the strain. They had to stabilize the transverse bulkhead before the flooding reached the primary electrical distribution center. The water was not just rising, it was electrified. The primary power lines for the starboard side of the fourth deck had been shredded by the kinetic passage of the missile, and the breakers had failed to trip automatically. Miller's team had to wait for the engineering officer of the watch to manually isolate the grid. In the flickering darkness, the only sound was the roar of the incoming sea and the frantic, rhythmic clanging of the shoring team's sledgehammers. They hammered wooden wedges into the gaps of the buckled door, trying to create a seal against the relentless pressure. The smell of burning rubber and wet ash was overwhelming, a toxic scent that seeped through the filters of their gas masks. Suddenly, a section of the overhead deck plating collapsed, raining down debris and severed fire main pipes. Miller felt the vibration through the deck. Beneath his boots, a deep, resonant shudder that vibrated in his very chest. Two of his sailors were knocked down by the sudden surge of water, their yellow life vests bobbing in the dark, debris-filled soup. They scrambled back to their feet, their faces masks of grease, salt, and determination. They managed to position a 3-meter steel beam against the bulging bulkhead, the hydraulic jack screaming as it forced the metal into place. For a moment, the groaning of the steel stopped. The shoring held, but the victory was localized. Beyond the bulkhead, the sounds of trapped air screaming through ventilation ducts told a different story of progressive flooding. Entire sections of the administrative decks had been obliterated, and the teams could hear the faint, desperate tapping of survivors trapped in air pockets in the adjoining compartments. There was no time for a delicate rescue. They had to keep the ship from losing its buoyancy. The damage control assistant's voice crackled over the ship's internal circuit, demanding a status update on the flooding in compartment 2-150-2. Miller keyed his handset, his voice raw from the smoke. He reported that the shoring was in place, but that the hull was still weeping from a dozen different stress fractures. As the heavy-duty submersible pumps finally began to hum, drawing the oily water out and discharging it over the side, the team allowed themselves 5 seconds of heavy breathing. The heat from the fuel fires on the decks above was still radiating through the overhead, turning the compartment into a literal pressure cooker. The USS Abraham Lincoln was still afloat, but she was wounded in her very bones. The structural integrity of the ship had been compromised in a way that no computer simulation had ever fully predicted. Down here, in the dark and the wet, there were no high-tech radars or hypersonic trajectories. There was only steel, wood, and the raw courage of sailors refusing to let their ships sink into the dark waters of the Arabian Sea. 8:20 in the evening. The escort ships of Carrier Strike Group 3 were no longer in their standard scouting positions. They were sprinting. The destroyer DDG-51 USS Mason and the cruiser CG-73 USS Port Royal had closed the distance to the USS Abraham Lincoln, forming a tight, protective diamond around the wounded giant. From the bridge of the Mason, the horizon was a jagged line of black sea and fire-stained sky. The air smelled of salt and the heavy sulfur of the destroyer's own exhaust as its 4 gas turbine engines pushed the vessel to 32 knots. The deck beneath the crew's feet was a constant, high-frequency vibration, a physical manifestation of the ship's desperate effort to shield its charge. The tactical order from the strike group commander was Aegis Integrated Fire Control Manual Overwrite. The ships were now linked in a digital spiderweb, sharing every byte of sensor data to create a single, unified picture of the airspace. Because the foreign military hypersonic missiles had proven they could hide from a single radar, the 3 ships were now offset, looking at the same patches of sky from different angles. They were searching for the atmospheric distortion, the faint, shimmering heat ghost of a weapon moving faster than the air could move out of its way. The USS Mason's Mark 41 vertical launch system was hot, the protective hatches of its 96 missile cells ready to be blown open at a millisecond's notice. The tension in the Mason's Combat Information Center was a physical weight. The room was cold, the air-conditioned chill designed to keep the massive ANSPY-6 processor stacks from melting under the load of the new, high-sensitivity search algorithms. The tactical action officer sat with his hand hovering inches above the weapons-free enable switch. They were no longer waiting for the computer to identify a target. They were waiting for a human to see a pattern in the noise. To the west, the foreign military coastline was a dark, silent shadow. But the military intelligence aircraft orbiting at 40,000 feet were picking up the telltale warm-up signatures of more mobile launchers near military port facility. The sea was running with 3-meter swells, and the Mason was pitching heavily as it cut across the wake of the carrier. Every time the bow slammed into a wave, a wall of white spray washed over the forward deck, instantly evaporating against the heated steel of the missile cells. The crew was at Condition 1 Alpha, the highest state of readiness for a missile engagement. In the engineering spaces, sailors stood by with manual overrides for every major system, prepared to fight the ship even if the central computer was knocked offline by an electromagnetic pulse or a direct hit. The coordination was absolute. The USS Port Royal, with its older but still potent SPY-1B radar, was focused on the high-altitude skip zone, while the Mason and the Lincoln's own remaining sensors monitored the terminal dive paths. They had created a shield wall of overlapping radar beams and interlocking fields of fire. If another missile appeared, it would not be facing a single ship's sensors, but a wall of electronic energy that was being manually tuned to find the impossible. The silence on the radio nets was broken only by short, clipped status reports. Mason, state of readiness. Green, Port Royal, state of readiness. Green. The carrier was still trailing a long, dark plume of smoke that stretched for miles. Behind them, a beacon for any seeker head. The escorts knew they were the only thing standing between the Lincoln and a finishing blow. They were no longer just ships. They were a single, integrated weapon system, its eyes wide open and its teeth bared. The Arabian Sea was quiet, but it was the silence of a fuse burning toward a blasting cap. 8:50 in the evening. The silence was shattered by a scream of electronic alarms that didn't rise in pitch. They exploded. Vampire, vampire, vampire erupted over the tactical net. A second foreign military hypersonic missile had just cleared the horizon, moving at Mach 6. This time, the naval warship was ready. The AN/SPY-6 radar, manually tuned to the plasma frequency, locked onto the shimmering heat ghost 12 miles out. The command was given instantly. Weapons free. Engage target 1002. The trigger was squeezed. From the forward, Mark 41 vertical launch system, 2 RIM 162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles shrieked off the rails. A twin column of white fire punched backward through the smoke, the intense heat blast washing across the faces of the bridge crew through the reinforced glass. The deck of the naval warship shuddered violently as the propellant ignited, filling the air with the sharp, chemical bite of solid rocket fuel. The interceptors streaked into the dark sky, their white exhaust trails carving jagged lines against the stars, as they strained to match the impossible speed of the incoming predator. The impact occurred only 4 miles from the aircraft carrier's starboard quarter. The first interceptor missed, but the second warhead punched straight into the missile's guidance section, detonating the high-explosive fragmentation sleeve. The hypersonic vehicle didn't just explode, it disintegrated under its own immense kinetic pressure. A fireball erupted that bleached the sky white for 3 full seconds, a blinding flash that reflected off the black water like a second sun. The warhead's remains and the heavy tungsten frame of the missile were sent flying in 1,000 directions, shredded into white-hot fragments that hissed as they hit the sea. The lead escort, the naval warship, took the brunt of the atmospheric shockwave. The blast wave, a physical wall of compressed air traveling at the speed of sound, slammed into the ship's side, throwing 3 sailors in the Combat Information Center off their chairs and cracking a heavy equipment rack. The sound was a detonation that cracked eardrums, followed by the terrifying screech of metal fragments peppering the naval warship's superstructure like high-velocity hail. One fragment, the size of a fist, tore through the ship's primary satellite dome, sending a spray of fiberglass shards across the bridge wing. Black smoke rose from the wreckage still settling into the sea, the surface of the water boiling where the largest pieces of the missile had submerged. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil and the ozone of the massive electrical discharge. The radio channels of the strike group went silent for exactly 3 seconds. as every operator processed the reality of a successful kinetic kill. Then, the net erupted in overlapping voices, reporting damage assessments and tracking data for any potential third wave. The shield had held, but the margin of victory had been measured in less than half a second. 9:30 in the evening. The center of the USS Abraham Lincoln's hangar deck, once a place of high-tech maintenance and choreographed aircraft movement, had been transformed into a field hospital of desperate necessity. The air was a thick, humid fog of white firefighting foam, the smell of burnt titanium, and the iron-copper scent of blood. Because the primary medical ward on the second deck had been partially compromised by smoke, the triage officer had ordered the move to the open hangar. Bright, portable halogen lights stood on tripods, casting harsh, long shadows against the blackened remains of an FA-18 Super Hornet. The deck was covered in green, yellow, and red tarps, used to categorize the wounded by the severity of their injuries. On the red tarps, the most critically injured lay in rows, their faces pale under the grime of soot and salt spray. Navy corpsmen, their blue digital camouflage uniforms soaked through with sweat and seawater, knelt over their patients, performing the brutal, necessary work of battlefield medicine. The sound of the hangar was a low, constant drone of portable oxygen concentrators, the rhythmic hiss of manual resuscitation bags, and the distant, hollow clang of damage control teams still shoring up the buckled elevator doors. A young sailor, a 20-year-old airman from the flight deck crew, gripped the hand of a corpsman as a medic applied a tourniquet to his right leg, which had been shredded by a fragment of the missile's kinetic shroud. There was no screaming, only the low, ragged sound of heavy breathing, and the occasional sharp command from the chief medical officer. The heat in the hangar remained stifling, nearly 95 degrees, as the ship's ventilation system was still being purged of smoke. Every few minutes, a fresh group of stretcher bearers arrived from the lower decks, carrying survivors who had been pulled from the flooded administrative compartments. The lists were already being compiled on digital tablets that flickered in the uncertain light. The names of the missing were read aloud in the Combat Direction Center, but here, the focus was only on the living. The hangar hospital was a testament to the resilience of the crew, but it was also a place of grim realization. The sheer velocity of the hypersonic strike meant that most of those caught in the immediate impact zone had not survived to reach triage. The wounded here were the victims of the secondary fireball and the violent structural collapse of the interior bulkheads. Medical supplies were being shuttled from the destroyer USS Mason via a daring helicopter transfer, as the carrier's list made a ship-to-ship transfer of personnel too dangerous. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter hovered just feet above the pitching aft deck, the downwash of its rotors whipping the mist and foam into a frenzy. The smell of jet exhaust from the hovering bird mixed with the acrid stench of the hangar, a reminder that the war was still happening, just beyond the steel walls. Despite the exhaustion visible in every pair of eyes, the discipline never wavered. As the first casualties were stabilized and moved toward the aft elevators for eventual evacuation, the chaplain moved among the green tarps, offering quiet words to those with minor burns and shrapnel wounds. The hangar, which had seen the launch of 1,000 sorties, was now the site of the ship's most important mission, the survival of its own people. The long night was far from over, but in the flickering halogen glow, the spirit of the Lincoln remained unbroken, even as the first names of the confirmed dead began to appear on the official tally. 10:45 in the evening. The time for defense had ended. From the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the captain looked out, across the dark water toward the escort ships. The strategic command from the Indo-Pacific Command had been authenticated. Execute Retaliatory Strike Package Alpha. The United States was no longer absorbing blows. It was preparing to return them with overwhelming force. The air around the strike group was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, industrial smell of burning fuel. But a new sound now dominated the night: the high-pitched, screaming whine of jet engines and the mechanical clatter of missile hatches opening. The destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser USS Port Royal moved into their launch positions 3 miles ahead of the carrier. Simultaneously, on the aft section of the Lincoln's flight deck, the only area still clear of debris and foam 4 FA-18 Super Hornets were being fueled by hand, their engines glowing with a dull orange heat in the darkness. The pilots sat in their cockpits, faces hidden by dark visors, their gloved hands moving through the final pre-flight checks. They were armed with AGM-88 HARM missiles and long-range standoff weapons, designed to blind the foreign military radar networks before the main hammer fell. The first volley came from the sea. From the Mark 41 vertical launch systems of the Escort ships, 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles erupted into the night sky in 10-second intervals. Each launch was a pillar of white-hot flame that illuminated the hulls of the ships and turned the black water into a mirror of fire. The roar of the rocket boosters was a physical force, a deep, rhythmic thudding that could be felt in the marrow of the sailors' bones. The missiles arched high into the atmosphere before their small turbofan engines ignited, and they leveled off, hugging the surface of the water at 500 miles per hour, heading straight for the mobile launcher sites near military port facility. Minutes later, the first Super Hornet was catapulted off the Lincoln's waistcat. The steam from the catapult mixed with the smoke from the hangar deck, creating a ghostly shroud as the 30-ton fighter was hurled from 0 to 160 knots in less than 3 seconds. The pilot felt the crushing pressure of 5 G-forces against his chest as the afterburners kicked in, 2 10-meter tongues of blue and yellow flame, pushing the aircraft into the night sky. 3 more fighters followed in rapid succession, their lights extinguished as they climbed toward the foreign military coast, their radars silent to avoid detection. The target was the 3rd Corded Air Defense Batteries and the suspected storage bunkers for the Fattah-2 hypersonic missiles. The coordinates, 27 degrees, 10 minutes north, 56 degrees, 15 minutes east, had been verified by satellite and electronic intelligence. The goal was total suppression. As the Tomahawks reached the coastline, they fanned out, their internal guidance systems using terrain contour matching to weave through the mountain passes. The foreign military defenders, who had celebrated the strike on the carrier only hours before, were now facing the calculated, systemic wrath of a carrier strike group that refused to be neutralized. Back on the Lincoln, the crew watched the horizon. To the north, the sky began to flicker with the distant, silent flashes of impact. Each flash represented the destruction of a radar site, a command center, or a missile silo. The hammer was falling with a precision that was both terrifying and absolute. The air on the carrier's bridge was cold now, the air conditioning struggling to keep up with the heat of the electronics, but the mood was one of grim satisfaction. The cost to the Lincoln had been high, but the response was designed to ensure that no second strike would ever be launched. The balance of power in the Arabian Sea was being restored in a sequence of fire and steel that stretched from the ocean floor to the edge of space. 1:30 in the morning. The isolation of the USS Abraham Lincoln was finally over. The horizon to the southwest was no longer empty. It was filled with the steady, blinking navigation lights of a massive aerial and naval relief force. Elements of the military forces, including 2 additional destroyers and a fast combat support ship, were now visible on the carrier's peripheral radar. High above, the sky was thick with the protective roar of jet fighter aircraft and military aircraft, which had scrambled from forward military airbase in Qatar to establish a combat air patrol that no regional power could challenge. The air around the carrier strike group was heavy with the smell of burnt aviation fuel and the ozone of high-powered radar arrays operating at maximum gain. The arrival of the reinforcement force brought a shift in the tactical atmosphere from a desperate fight for survival to a structured, reinforced defensive posture. The newcomers, led by the naval warship, integrated seamlessly into the Aegis network. They formed an outer picket line 60 miles from the Lincoln, creating a deep-tier defense designed to intercept any further hypersonic or ballistic threats long before they reached the wounded carrier. The engineering miracle began with the arrival of the Fast Combat Support Ship, which drew alongside the Lincoln at a distance of only 50 meters. Despite the heavy swells of the Arabian Sea and the carrier's persistent 4-degree list, the crews executed a high-line transfer of critical components, Huge wooden crates containing emergency submersible pumps, structural shoring timbers, and specialized electrical bypass kits were winched across the gap between the two ships. The sound of the ocean slamming against the hulls was a constant, rhythmic boom, but the sailors on the deck worked with a cold, mechanical focus, ignoring the spray of salt water that soaked their uniforms. Among the reinforcements was a specialized Navy mobile diving and salvage unit. They arrived via military helicopters, rappelling onto the flight deck with heavy bags of underwater welding equipment and sonar imaging tools. Their mission was to assess the damage below the waterline that the internal teams could not reach. Within 20 minutes of landing, the first pair of divers was in the water. Their helmet lights cutting through the murky, oil-stained depths near the impact site. They reported back to the bridge that the main structural frames were holding, though the puncture in the hull was jagged and sprawling, requiring a massive external patch before the ship could increase speed. The presence of the jet fighter aircraft provided a psychological shield as much as a physical one. Their sensors, far more advanced than those of the carrier's own damaged systems, were now acting as the eyes of the fleet. They could see deep into foreign territory, tracking every movement of a mobile launcher or the ignition of a radar site. The data was fed directly into the Lincoln's Combat Direction Center, where the weary technicians finally felt the pressure lift. For the first time since 6:45 that evening, the ghost in the machine had been cornered. The threat of a surprise strike had been neutralized by the arrival of the full weight of military headquarters facility commands. As the sun began to hint at its arrival with a faint gray line on the eastern horizon, the USS Abraham Lincoln sat at the center of a steel fortress. The fires were out, the flooding was contained, and the skies were owned by the military forces. The air was colder now, the morning mist carrying the scent of the open sea rather than the acrid tang of the hangar fire. The carrier was wounded, but she was surrounded by her sisters. The message to the world was clear. The Lincoln would not be left to the dark. 4 in the morning. The USS Abraham Lincoln began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the south. The engineering department, working in the light of portable battery-powered lanterns, had achieved a miracle of jury-rigged mechanics. By bypassing the shattered primary switchboards and rerouting high-voltage cables through the mess decks and laundry facilities, they had restored power to the starboard propeller shaft. The giant ship groaned as the massive bronze screws turned for the first time in nearly 10 hours, biting into the dark water of the Arabian Sea. The carrier was vibrating with a heavy, uneven rhythm, its speed limited to exactly 8 knots to prevent the water pressure from collapsing the temporary shoring in the lower decks. The air in the engineering spaces was a suffocating 110 degrees, thick with the smell of hot grease, steam, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh weld seams. Every sailor in the black gang was soaked to the bone in sweat, their hands covered in the black residue of emergency sealant. They were operating on pure adrenaline and the knowledge that every mile they covered took them further from the range of the coastal missile batteries. The damage control assistant stood in the middle of the auxiliary machinery room, his eyes fixed on a series of analog pressure gauges. If the temporary patch on the hull failed, the incoming sea would drown the remaining motors in seconds. The long transit was a test of endurance for the entire crew. On the flight deck, the crash and salvage teams were using heavy forklifts to push the charred, skeletal remains of the destroyed Super Hornets toward the edge. With a final, metallic screech, the blackened hulks were shoved into the sea to clear the deck for emergency landings. The sight of nearly $100 million of aircraft sinking into the depths was a somber reminder of the night's cost. The wind over the deck carried the scent of salt spray and the lingering, faint smell of the AFFF foam that still coated the scuppers in thick, white clumps. The escort ships, led by the naval warship, moved in a tight protective screen only 500 meters from the carrier's beam. They were so close that the sailors on the naval warship could see the jagged, blackened hole in the Lincoln's side, a wound that looked like a giant had taken a bite out of the steel. The destroyers acted as a physical barrier against the swells, their hulls breaking the force of the waves to keep the carrier from rolling too heavily to its damaged side. The coordination was a masterpiece of seamanship, with the ships maintaining their positions with less than a 5-meter variance despite the 3-meter seas. Communication with the outside world was limited to encrypted tactical bursts. The strategic objective was simple: reach the deep water port at Duke, Oman, where a heavy lift salvage crane and a team of structural engineers were already waiting. The transit would take over 36 hours at this pace, a grueling period of vulnerability where every radar contact was a potential threat and every creak of the hull was a potential failure. The carrier's list had been reduced to 2 degrees through the careful shifting of thousands of tons of fuel and fresh water to the port-side tanks, but the ship remained a fragile shadow of its former self. As the morning light began to turn the sky a pale, translucent blue, the crew of the Lincoln stood at their stations, eyes bloodshot and faces etched with exhaustion. They were moving through a landscape of iron and water, propelled by a combination of desperate engineering and raw willpower. The long transit was not a victory parade. It was a slow-motion retreat of a wounded Titan, guarded by a shield wall that refused to break. The silence of the morning was broken only by the steady, labored thud of the carrier's engines, a heartbeat that signaled the ship was still alive. 6 in the morning. The sun rose over the Arabian Sea, not with the fire of the previous night, but with a cold, clear light that revealed the true extent of the trial. The USS Abraham Lincoln was still moving, a dark silhouette against the shimmering gold of the water, its wake a straight, determined line heading south. The smoke that had dominated the sky for 12 hours had finally thinned to a faint gray wisp. The air was crisp, carrying the clean scent of the open ocean, finally purging the heavy, metallic stench of the hangar fire. On the flight deck, the crew stood in a ragged but disciplined formation for the first morning muster since the strike. The tally of the engagement was written in the silence between the words of the executive officer. The final report confirmed that 74 personnel had been killed in action, most during the initial kinetic impact and the subsequent fireball in the administrative decks. Another 128 sailors were being treated for severe burns, smoke inhalation, and shrapnel wounds, with many already evacuated to land-based hospitals. 4 FA-18 Super Hornets were lost, and a 5-meter section of the starboard hull remained a twisted ruin of blackened steel. Yet, the ship was under its own power. Its nuclear reactors were stable, and its combat systems were being restored, deck by deck. Strategically, the engagement had changed the calculus of naval warfare in an instant. The Lincoln breach proved that the era of absolute carrier invulnerability was over, ended by the physics of hypersonic speed. However, the American response had been equally transformative. The success of the manual Aegis override on the second missile demonstrated that human intuition and training could still outmatch a machine's velocity. The retaliatory strike had neutralized the Iranian hypersonic capability for the foreseeable future, destroying 12 mobile launchers and 3 command and control bunkers. The cost had been severe, but the carrier strike group had remained a cohesive, lethal force even under the most extreme conditions. In the Combat Direction Center, the technicians were already downloading the sensor logs for a total redesign of the Aegis tracking algorithms. The ghost in the machine would be hunted, coded, and neutralized in the software of every ship in the fleet. The lessons learned in the blood and fire of the last 14 hours would be disseminated across the Navy within days. The professionalism of the crew, from the 19-year-old firefighters in the hangar to the senior engineers in the dark of the lower decks, had prevented a tactical setback from becoming a national catastrophe. As the Lincoln neared the territorial waters of Oman, the escort ships of Carrier Strike Group 3 performed a final maneuver. The USS Mason and the USS Port Royal surged ahead, their flags snapping in the side, morning breeze, before turning to dip their colors in a silent salute to the carrier. It was an acknowledgement of the Lincoln's resilience, and a tribute to those who would not be returning home. The deck of the carrier was a landscape of scars, but it was also a place of immense, quiet pride. The ship had been hit with the most advanced weapon in the world, and it had refused to sink. The final entry in the captain's log for the 13th of March, 2026, was brief. It did not speak of hypersonic trajectories or geopolitical consequences. It noted only that the watch had been stood, the fires had been extinguished, and the ship remained on station. The USS Abraham Lincoln would spend months in a dry dock. Its hull would be patched with new steel, and its systems would be upgraded with new eyes. But the spirit of the crew, tempered in the furnace of a Mach 6 impact, was already back at full strength. The long night was over, and the morning belonged to the survivors.